Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us today for another session of Sutta study with Bhante Suddhaso. So today we'll be taking a look at the Gilana Sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book 3, 22. And if you'd like to read along with us, you can click the link in the chat for Bhante Suddhaso's translation. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in, and Bhante will address them at the end of the talk. So good morning so far to Geeta, Poonam, Robin, Jens, and Galaxy from Malaysia. And at this time, I'll pass to Bhante, who will guide us in some words of Dhamma.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So as mentioned, we'll be going through Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Threes, Sutta number 22, Gilana Sutta. So the word Gilana means sickness or illness. And in the context of the sutta, it's particularly referring to people who are sick. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations. This is a pretty short sutta, so we might go through it fairly quickly. And as usual, if you have questions or comments at any time, please go ahead and enter them in the live chat, and we'll answer them at the end. So the sutta begins. So this is presumably the Buddha speaking, although this particular sutta doesn't actually specifically mention the name or identity of the speaker, nor does it give any indication of place. So many suttas start with a standard opening. Thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was living at such and such a place with such and such a group of people. But this sutta doesn't give any introduction of that sort. It just launches directly into the speech. So the sutta begins. Monks, there are 3 kinds of sick people found in the world. What 3? Monks, this is one kind of sick person. Whether they get suitable food or not, whether they get suitable medicine or not, whether they get a suitable attendant or not, they will not recover from their illness. Monks, this is another kind of sick person. Whether they get suitable food or not, whether they get suitable medicine or not, whether they get a suitable attendant or not, they will recover from their illness. Monks, this is another kind of sick person. They will only recover from their illness if they get suitable food, suitable medicine, and a suitable attendant. So these are the 3 kinds of sick people that the Buddha is introducing. So the first kind of person is somebody who, no matter what you do, they're not going to get better. They're just going to get worse and perhaps eventually die from their illness or just remain chronically ill for the rest of their life. The second kind of person is someone who they're bound to recover. So it doesn't actually matter how much effort you put into looking after them or taking care of them. They're already on the upward course that leads to recovery. And the third kind of person is somebody who, if they're not properly taken care of, if they're not looked after carefully, then they will decline. But if they are looked after carefully, then they will recover. These are the 3 kinds of sick people that he's mentioning. Then the Buddha says, in that case, monks, it is because of the sick person who will only recover from their illness if they get suitable food, suitable medicine, and a suitable attendant, that it is advisable to arrange proper food, medicine, and an attendant for sick people. However, monks, because of this kind of sick person, one should also look after the other kinds of sick people. So in other words, the Buddha is saying that the reason why we should make an effort to take care of those who are sick is because some people will only get better if they're taken care of. Some people will only get better if we make a sincere effort to get the best food, to get the right medicines, to arrange a nurse or a doctor or a caretaker to look after them and pay close attention to them. So the other two kinds of people are, well, the first kind is hopeless. Nothing that we can do will make a difference. And the second kind of person, again, no matter what we do, they'll get better. But the Buddha says that because of the kind of person who will get better only if they're properly taken care of, because of that kind of person, we should also look after the other two. So this might seem like an odd statement. If only the third kind of person is the one where it matters whether or not we take care of them, why does the Buddha say that we should also look after the other kinds? And there's a few reasons which can come quickly to mind for this. One is that we need to acknowledge our own insufficiency of wisdom. We need to acknowledge the possibility that we might misjudge. We might think that somebody is going to get better, and therefore we don't need to pay such close care. We don't need to pay close attention and give good care to them. But we might be wrong. They might actually be the kind of person who will only improve if they're carefully taken care of. So we might misjudge the situation and not give sufficient attention to somebody who needs to be taken care of, and they might, as a result, decline. As an example, a friend of mine who lives in New York City, two of his friends died from the coronavirus, and one of them was an elderly person with a pre-existing heart condition. So that was a case where the doctors did the best they could, but they knew it was pretty much a lost cause from the beginning. So nobody was surprised when that person passed away. The other person was a young man in his 30s who had no health problems. So very good physical condition, very good health overall. So when he got sick and went to the hospital, the doctors paid very little attention to him and sent him home very quickly, telling him that he would just get better on his own at home and there was no point in him being at the hospital. They were wrong. He did not get better. Instead, his health rapidly declined and he died at home because of a lack of medical care. He wasn't given the proper care. So that's an example of where we can make a mistaken judgment. We can assume that somebody doesn't need close attention when they do. And bad things can come about as a result of that. Another reason for this is the arising of jealousy. So you have these three patients, these three sick people, and you're paying a lot of attention to one of them and very little to the other two. Well, the other two might start to get jealous. They might start to get upset or disturbed. Like, why are you paying attention to that third person, but you're not looking after us? Why is it that they get special treatment, but we don't? So the Buddha here is also encouraging that mind of impartiality, of treating people fairly and equally. So even when you know that somebody's just going to get worse no matter what you do, you still look after them because you don't want to create the conditions for them to give rise to unwholesome mind states. You don't want to create the conditions that might lead to them producing resentment, to holding a grudge, to bearing hostility or aversion towards you or towards the patient that you're looking after. And finally, another reason for this is the cultivation of compassion. So one of the central aspects of the Buddhist practice is living compassion. So we cultivate compassion as a mind state. So wishing for others to be happy, wishing for others to be healthy, wishing for others to be safe. But it's not enough for that just to be an attitude. It's not enough for that just to be a mind state. It's something that we need to do. It's something which needs to be acted upon. So the Buddha says that we should express loving kindness and compassion with body, speech, and mind. He doesn't say to only practice it with mind. He says to practice it with body, speech, and mind. So he says that we should constantly be performing acts of loving kindness, physically, verbally, and mentally, both openly and privately, both publicly and privately. Again, it's this emphasis on actually doing things for the benefit of others, doing things out of compassion for others, doing things out of a sincere wish to reduce the pain and suffering and misery and torment of others, to bring more lightness and ease to their lives, to bring more joy and contentment into their lives. So even if you know somebody is just going to continue declining and pass away from their illness, or if you know that they have a chronic disease which is impossible to cure with our current understanding, still we look after them and we take care of them, because doing so brings a bit more lightness and ease into their life. Doing so makes them feel looked after, feel taken care of. Even if we know that our efforts are futile, the patient may not feel that it's futile because they're being taken care of. They know that somebody is doing their best to look after them. And there is still that slim chance that maybe we're wrong. Maybe they will improve if they're looked after. So cultivating that mind of compassion, of always seeing what we can do in order to improve the conditions for others. And it's really important that we make sure to apply this principle of compassionately taking care of others as broadly and deeply as possible in our lives. So one of the dangers that can sometimes arise in Buddhist practice is what these days is sometimes called spiritual bypassing. So where we say a lot of high-minded spiritual things, but in actuality, we're ignoring the applicability of those spiritual values to our everyday life. To the point where we might even use concepts of spirituality in order to intentionally neglect or ignore the application of our spiritual values to our life. So an example of this would be saying, I maintain neutrality. I don't get involved in disputes. But actually, we're just using that as a smokescreen to avoid talking about uncomfortable issues. We're using it as a feint or a ploy so that we don't have to talk about things which might upset people or disturb people. So an example of this is the racial tensions in this country these days. From a Buddhist standpoint, racism is completely unwholesome. It's completely unacceptable. There's no justification for it whatsoever. So then the compassionate thing is always to openly state this. The compassionate thing is always to stand up for what's right. To point out that the Buddha condemned racism, that the Buddha opposed racism. This is the proper thing to do. But then if we take some other element of Buddhism, such as the teaching on equanimity, and we say, I just practice equanimity towards racial tension, well, that's just spiritual bypassing. That's not compassion at all. Or if we say, I can't do anything about it anyway, so I'll just be neutral, I'll just be apolitical. Well, that's like the case of the first kind of sick person, where no matter what we do, they're not going to recover. But the Buddha says we should still take care of them. We should still look after them. Even if we think it's utterly futile and hopeless, we still take care of them and look after them out of compassion. So in the same way, even if we think we can't do anything at all about the problems of discrimination in this modern world that we live in, we should still make an effort out of compassion. And also recognizing the chance that maybe we can make a difference. Maybe we can improve the situation to some degree. So again, not just trying to paste over the issue with this big blank screen of I'm practicing equanimity and neutrality. It's like, no. The Buddha spoke about compassion through body, speech, and mind. So being a living beacon of goodness in the world, not just trying to be uninvolved, but actually acting out these principles of goodness. And in the case of somebody, again, who's going to get better no matter what we do, again, this is a situation where we need to be very careful, because it's very easy to fall into apathy. It's like, well, things are getting better, so who cares? I'm just going to go stick my head in the corner and wait for things to improve. Well, once again, maybe we're right. Maybe things will get better no matter what we do. But what are we cultivating? When we go and we stick our head in the corner and choose not to care, choose not to be involved, what happens? What happens to our own mind? What happens is that we're cultivating a habit of apathy. We're building up a habit of not caring. We're building up a habit of not being considerate and attentive to others. So maybe in the case where things are getting better no matter what we do, maybe in that case it doesn't matter so much that we're not getting involved. But the habit of apathy and inconsideration that we're building up is extremely destructive. It's extremely harmful. This is the kind of unwholesome mind state that leads to terrible disasters happening in the world while people stand by and do nothing. While people do nothing to help, do nothing to improve the situation. So we always need to be attentive. What habits are we nurturing in our mind? Every single thought that we deliberately think is watering the seeds of a habit. Every single word that we speak is watering the seeds of a habit. Every single action we take is watering the seeds of a habit. So what habits do we want to nurture? And what habits do we want to stomp out? Again, it's like the case of a garden. If you're growing a garden, then you water the flowers and vegetables, but you don't water the weeds. In fact, usually when you notice the weeds, you try to pull them out or crush them down. You don't water the weeds, you water the flowers and the vegetables. So it's the same with our mind. We need to be really careful. What seeds are we watering in our mind? Are we watering the seeds of apathy? Or are we watering the seeds of compassion? So then the Buddha carries on with this simile and makes it more directly related to Buddhism. It's already clearly Buddhist, but he just drives the point home more specifically. He says, in the same way, monks, there are three kinds of people found in the world who are like sick people. What three? Monks, this is one kind of person. Whether they get to see the Tathagata is another word for the Buddha. We'll speak about the word Tathagata a bit later on. Whether they get to see the Tathagata or not, whether they get to hear the teachings and trainings taught by the Tathagata or not, they will not progress reliably and correctly in goodness. So this is somebody who, even if they don't get to hear the Buddhist teachings, even if they have no exposure to the concepts of right and wrong, no exposure to the teachings of morality and concentration and wisdom, even if they're not taught about precepts, meditation practices, whether they hear these teachings or not, they're not going to make progress in developing a wholesome mind. So an example of this is I've met a number of people over the years who they come in contact with Buddhism. Maybe they even read a bunch of the scriptures, listen to a bunch of talks, go to some meditation classes, visit some monasteries, but it just never seems to penetrate into their mind. And they continue going about in the world, self-centered, apathetic, uncaring, fixated on their desires and aversions. They just keep nurturing the same bad habits they were nurturing before they encountered Buddhist teachings. They just keep doing the same unwholesome actions that they were doing before they encountered Buddhist teachings. And this can be really surprising sometimes, because every now and then you'll meet somebody who they've actually studied the Buddhist scriptures extensively, and they can engage in very educated discussions and debates around the meanings of this and the meanings of that. And yet, you look at their conduct, and their conduct is not in line with the Buddhist teachings. You look at how they act, how they speak, how they think, and it's all dominated, once again, by self-centeredness, by delusion, by craving, by anger, by hatred. So one of the examples the Buddha gives, one of the similes he gives, he says it's like a spoon in a pot of soup. Even though the spoon is completely immersed in the soup, the spoon never tastes the soup. The spoon has no concept of what the soup tastes like. The spoon is incapable of tasting the soup, even though it's completely immersed in it. So this is the case for some people. Even if they extensively study the Buddha's teachings, it doesn't sink in. They just don't get it. And they keep living their self-centered life. And the second example he gives, he says, monks, this is another kind of person. Whether they get to see the Tathagata or not, whether they get to hear the teachings and trainings taught by the Tathagata or not, they will progress reliably and correctly in goodness. So this is the case of someone who they have some kind of innate understanding of right and wrong. Their conscience is finely tuned. They have an innate recognition of the value of generosity, the value of morality, the value of a stable and peaceful mind, the value of renunciation, the value of contentment, the value of equanimity, the value of compassion. So where is that coming from? Well, from a Buddhist standpoint, we would say it's coming from past lives. That this is a person who has extensively cultivated spiritual practices that are either Buddhist or Buddhist in past lives. So in this life, they already have the habits of goodness in place. They don't need to build up those habits from scratch, because they already have them well developed and well refined. And it's just a matter of them continuing to make progress. This can also be the case of some people who they only hear a little bit of the Buddhist teachings, but they understand it very swiftly and easily, which actually is not far out, because the Buddhist teachings fundamentally are quite simple. Can actually give a complete explanation of Buddhist theory and practice in about 10 minutes. Less if you speak quickly. Even less if the person you're talking to is a particularly sharp mind. And then it's just a matter of living accordingly, training the mind accordingly. So this can also be the case of somebody who maybe they've already learned enough. Maybe they've already encountered the teachings that they need to hear. So there's an interesting story from the suttas of a person who they actually only heard a couple of short sentences of the Buddha's teachings, but it was just what they needed to hear. They had to teach causality, on the impermanence of all things, and on the possibility of enlightenment. And it was those key concepts that were enough to establish that person firmly on the path to full awakening. So it was hearing, oh, everything that comes into being has a cause. In other words, nothing happens randomly. Nothing happens chaotically. We live in an orderly, causal universe, running on the principles of causes and conditions, cause and effect. So that already is a tremendous shift in perspective. So at the time of the Buddha, there were many different beliefs floating around about how the universe operated. So some people taught that everything was completely chaotic and random. Others taught that everything was predeterministic, that our choices were irrelevant because everything was already predetermined and we were just living out a track which has the illusion of free will, but actually there's no free will. That was one common belief. Another common belief was that there was one or more all-powerful deities which were controlling everything. Another was that we did have free will, but that our choices were ultimately irrelevant. So there were many different viewpoints at the time. And the Buddha presented a distinct statement. He said, everything is causal, so everything has a cause, and every choice that we make creates a corresponding consequence. So this is what we call karma, the teachings on karma. It's these two basic ideas. One, everything is causal. Every cause has an effect. Every effect has a preceding cause. And two, every single choice that we make produces a corresponding consequence that we experience. So that was the first major thing which turned to this person's mind. This idea that everything that comes into being has a cause. Nothing is random. Second, that everything is impermanent. Well, everything? Well, yes, everything, without exception. So this also is something which can radically alter the way one sees the world. So normally the way we tend to approach things is we recognize that some things are impermanent. Breakfast was impermanent. It started, it ended, clearly impermanent. My great-grandmother was impermanent. She was born long before I was. She lived a long life. She passed away a while ago. So clearly that was also impermanent. Irritation, also impermanent. I was irritated at some point in the past and I'm not currently irritated. But then we naturally tend to assume that there is something which is permanent. So underneath all this superficial surface layer stuff that's clearly changing all the time, underneath that, there must be something that's permanent. Maybe many things that are permanent. We think our sense of self is permanent. We tend to think that the physical universe itself is permanent. But as we look more closely, we see that our sense of self is also constantly changing. My self-identity now is dramatically different than it was 20 years ago. My mom could certainly attest to that. I'm not even remotely the same person now as I was then. There's only superficial similarities. Maybe more than superficial. I don't know what she would think about that. Maybe we'll ask her later. The physical universe, what is it that we think is stable or permanent? Look more closely. If you look more closely, you see that your experience of the physical universe is constantly changing. There's actually nothing which remains the same for even a moment. And of course, modern physics is saying that on the subatomic level, the universe is more like a constantly bubbling foam. It's more, a lot more fluid and dynamic than it looks. So you look at a wall and you think that wall is pretty stable and solid, but that's just because we're not looking closely enough. On a subatomic level, that wall is composed of a bunch of little particles and waves which are constantly blinking in and out of existence, which are constantly bubbling and roiling and tumbling about. And it only looks like a solid object because we're looking at it on an extremely large scale, which gives the illusion of stability, the illusion of permanence. But we also know it's not permanent. An example of this, which I personally find fascinating, is if you go in a really old building and you look at a really old glass window, you'll notice that the glass window no longer has parallel walls, parallel edges. It's slumped a little bit over time into a pyramid shape. So over time, the glass slowly drips down to create more of a triangle shape rather than a rectangle cross section. So even something which seems solid is not solid. Even something which seems stable is not stable. So again, for some people, just hearing these concepts, even just hearing the word enlightenment or awakening, and then someone thinks, oh, there is such a thing. It's possible to come to a direct understanding of reality. I don't need to be forever mystified. I don't need to rely on blind faith. I don't need to be confused. I can come to a point where I directly know and understand for myself the nature of reality. So some people, they just need to hear a few sentences of Dhamma, and then they're set for the rest of their life. For the rest of their life, they just keep practicing in line with those few sentences, and they'll keep making progress. Also on the subject of morality, some people need hundreds and hundreds of pages of extensively documented analysis of the proper way to act in different situations. But actually, the Buddhist principle of morality is extremely simple. Don't hurt anyone. Try to help everyone. That's it. Not very complicated. It can get confusing in trying to figure out exactly how to apply that in different situations. But if you rely on that basic motivation of trying not to hurt people and instead trying to help people, if you just keep coming back to that basic motivation and you do your best to understand the situation you're in and the consequences of your choices, then you will inevitably behave with very good morality. Inevitably. So a very simple principle. Don't hurt anyone. Try to help people. That's it. So of course we have lists of precepts. So for the ordinary Buddhist layperson, there's 5 precepts. For a renunciant layperson or one who's living in a monastery, commonly there's 8 precepts. And for someone who chooses to become a monk, well, it starts at 10 and it rapidly goes up from there into hundreds and thousands. But these are merely refinements on this simple basic principle. Don't hurt people, try to help people. That's it. So some people, that's all they need to hear. And they'll figure out the rest on their own. They'll figure out the details on their own as they go through their life. Similarly with meditation practice, you can read hundreds and hundreds of pages about how to practice samadhi, how to practice concentration. But actually it's really simple. Just don't move your mind. Do you know how to keep your body still? Simple. Just don't move your body. The same. Do you want to keep your mind still? Well, just don't move your mind. Some people, that's all they need to hear. And they'll figure out the details on their own. And it's the same with the cultivation of wisdom. The basic idea of wisdom is all things are unsatisfying, impermanent, and impersonal. That's it. Contemplate that, and you'll attain full enlightenment. It's really as simple as that. So of course, again, we have thousands and thousands of pages of Buddhist scriptures to try to explain a bit more about just what that means. But ultimately, it's this very simple principle. And some people, they hear that and they contemplate it, they get it. It might take them a few decades or a few lifetimes or a few eons, but eventually they get it. So this is another case of somebody who, regardless of whether or not they encounter Buddha, regardless of whether or not they hear the teachings and trainings of the Buddha, they will inevitably make progress in the path of goodness, the path of awakening. And then the third kind of person, similar to the third kind of sick people, it says this is another kind of person. They will only progress reliably and correctly in goodness if they get to see the Tathagata and to hear the teachings and trainings taught by the Tathagata. So this is like the sick person who will only get better if they're taken care of properly. Similarly, there are some people who, if they don't hear the Dhamma, if they don't hear the Buddha's teachings, if they don't hear about the trainings in developing one's morality, concentration, and wisdom, then they'll tend to just follow their ordinary worldly habits, their ordinary worldly beliefs. Beliefs like money equals happiness, having children equals happiness, accumulating possessions equals happiness, fame equals happiness. They'll follow these usual worldly delusions. And as a result, they will not be happy. They will be miserable. And as a result, they might do very unwholesome things. So in the pursuit of money, wealth, fame, sensuality, acquisition, and so on, people will do the most despicable things. They'll lie, they'll kill, they'll steal, they'll cheat. They'll do the most horrific things out of this delusional belief that money, wealth, fame, acquisition, and so on is happiness, is the key to happiness. But if they hear these teachings that actually contentment is happiness, not acquisition, compassion is happiness, renunciation is happiness, serenity is happiness, then sometimes that turns their mind around and they start to think, oh, maybe there's another way of living, a more peaceful way of living, a more blissful way of living, which is different from what I've been taught my whole life, which is different from what I see in the media, which is different from the messages I've been getting in school. Maybe there's another way of living. A way of living which doesn't depend upon money and wealth and acquisition and so on. So then naturally the Buddha says, in that case, monks, it is because of the person who will only progress reliably and correctly in goodness if they get to see the Tathagata and to hear the teachings and trainings taught by the Tathagata, that it is advisable to teach the Dhamma. However, monks, because of this kind of person, one should also teach the Dhamma to the other kinds of people. Monks, these are the three kinds of people found in the world who are like sick people. So again, teaching the Dhamma is important because there are some people who they will only develop in goodness, they will only develop in wisdom if they get the right teachings, the right instructions, the right support. So that's the most critical reason to teach the Dhamma. But we also share the Dhamma with everyone we encounter who might be interested. Because there's always the possibility that we misjudge, that someone who we think is hopeless is actually not hopeless. They just need to hear the right things. And another reason for this, again, is cultivating compassion. Maybe they're hopeless in this life, but we can plant seeds that will ripen in a future life. Maybe this time around, there's no chance whatsoever that they're going to make progress towards awakening. But seeing a monk, hearing a few words from the Buddha, maybe that plants something in their mind which ripens in a future life. Maybe that develops into something good later on. So it's important to cultivate that mind of compassion, of always allowing the possibility that sharing the Dhamma with those we encounter will bring some good results into their lives. And also to reflect on how much we've benefited from hearing the Dhamma, on all the goodness that's come into our lives, and recognizing that we have the ability to share that with other people, bring that into other people's lives as well. And another reason to teach the Dhamma, not just to the third kind of person, but also to the other two, is to refine and develop your skill. So the art of teaching the Dhamma is not necessarily straightforward. It takes practice, and it takes experience, and trial and error. And a lot of that comes just through practice, through trying to explain things to people, through engaging in genuine dialogue with other people, trying to get an understanding of how people think, how they perceive the world, how their experience of the world is different from our own. This is a really important point, actually, which is that we see the world through our own eyes. We do not see it through other people's eyes. We experience the world through our own body. We do not experience it through other people's bodies. So for example, as a person in a white male body, I have one set of experiences, which is dramatically different from the experiences of somebody in a black female body. So there's tremendous value to asking people who have different experiences than us, what is your experience? What is your life like? What have you gone through? How do you see these situations? What's your perspective on these conditions? So really making that sincere effort to broaden our understanding of the human experience, recognizing that we're only ever seeing a tiny fraction of reality. And that through listening carefully to others, we can broaden our view. And by broadening our view of the world, we can broaden our view of the Dhamma. By broadening our understanding of the human experience, we can broaden our understanding of how the Dhamma applies to the human experience. And maybe we'll start to see that certain teachings which were really profound and transformative to us are utterly meaningless and useless to some of the people we encounter. And some of the teachings which seemed useless to us are exactly what some others need to hear. So this also is why we should always make an effort. We should always make an effort to broaden our understanding of the breadth of human experience and the applicability of the Dhamma. So one of the aspects of the Dhamma is that it's applicable to everyone. It's not exclusive to a particular class. It's not exclusive to a particular gender, particular race, particular nationality. It applies equally to everyone. And not just to humans, it also applies to animals and spirits of all sorts. But it's easiest for us to communicate with other humans, most of us. Some of us have the ability to communicate with other beings, and those who do what you do. But for those of us who just communicate with other humans, we make that effort to explore the applicability of the Dhamma to all humans, to all lives. We make that effort to see how can we take these simple instructions of happiness and wisdom and present them in a way which is meaningful and beneficial to the people that we encounter. And sometimes, by the way, sometimes this means not using the words Buddha or Buddhism or Dhamma. Sometimes it just means talking about the Dhamma in ordinary ways. Like somebody starts going on lamenting about how upset they are that they didn't get to try the cake last night. And you can say like, why are you upset? Is it because you didn't get the cake? Or is it because you want the cake? What's actually the problem here? Is it the lack of cake? Or is it the desire? What's actually making you miserable? It's the desire, isn't it? So sometimes there's ways of pointing directly to the root of suffering in someone's mind, pointing directly to the root of their sadness and confusion, without actually needing to use the word Buddhism at all, because it's not necessarily needed. Ultimately, what we're talking about is simply the human experience, how we create our own happiness and sadness in every moment, and how we can start to take control of that process. So we make the effort. We make the effort to help everyone that we encounter. So in tangible ways and in less tangible ways, in physical ways and in spiritual ways. We do what we can. So that's the end of this sutta. Again, a relatively short sutta that I made seem longer than it was by talking a lot. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, if you're joining us remotely, you can type them in. If you're here in the room, you can raise your hand, and I'll answer your questions as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And welcome to some more friends joining in. So Michael, Elaine, Liz, Eleanor, Prius Video, Laura, and Ishan. So good to see everyone. And there's a couple questions. So Eleanor asks, if resources are limited and we have to make a choice as to whom to attend to, how do we choose? I think there's a story about that from the Buddha, but I don't remember which one.
Yeah, that's an awkward situation. So that's been coming up with the pandemic that's going on in some countries, including the US, as well as some others. This exact situation has come up, shortage of resources. So what do you do in those situations? It's a really difficult choice. And in those situations, you do the best you can. Again, you keep your motivation of helping people. You keep that motivation clear, and you act on that motivation. And when you're faced with a choice where the choices seem equally balanced, then ultimately it doesn't really matter which one you choose, does it? So just pick one. Flip a coin if you have to. It doesn't really matter in that case, does it? But if you carefully weigh your options and one of them is even slightly more compassionate than the others, then that's what you do. So it's actually not such a difficult situation when you look right at it. It's harder in your mind than it is in reality. In reality, when you're faced with a situation, you evaluate it and you see what is the most compassionate choice, and that's what you pick. And if it's really, really perfectly balanced, then it doesn't matter what you pick because either one is the right choice. Okay.
And the follow-up is, should one ever put that person's life in danger to save someone else?
That's also a complicated question. So it's something where you have to make the judgment for yourself in the situation that you're in. Again, always remembering that to intentionally harm another person is unwholesome. But that if you're faced with a choice where if you go to save person A, then person B will die. And if you go to save person B, then person A will die. Well, in that case, if your motivation is to save person A, then you're not doing anything unwholesome. Or if your motivation is to save person B, then you're not doing anything unwholesome. You're just doing the best you can with the conditions that you have. It's not always possible to save everyone. If you can, try. But usually it's not possible to save everyone. Usually there's limitations to our abilities. So you do the best you can within the domain of your abilities. So yeah, there are cases. So again, I mentioned earlier the case of the young man who was sent home from the hospital. They weren't just doing that to be mean. They were doing that because the hospitals were swamped. The hospitals were overflowing. There were only so many doctors and nurses to go around, and they were getting sick too. So they made the judgment. This guy is probably going to get better if he's at home. But there's other people here who, if we send them home, they're almost certainly going to die. So they made a judgment call based on the sincere wish to help as many people get better as possible. In this case, were they wrong? Possibly. But their motivations were right. So that's ultimately what we come down to. Is our motivation one of compassion? And are we making a sincere effort to understand the potential consequences of our choices? Then you'll be okay. That will always steer you in the right direction. Okay.
Thank you. And Priya's video asks, situations where you hear of a person suffering from their own life, and they ask you to help guide them, but we think that the person suffering has to help themselves. Is it a good choice to be silent in those situations?
Well, it's important once again to be compassionate. So it's possible to give exactly the same message in two different ways. One way where it feels like harshly dismissing the person, and another way where it feels like gently commiserating with the person while communicating that they need to figure it out on their own. So if somebody comes to you and they start laying out their problems and you're like, bah, figure it out on your own. Stop bothering me. Well, that's not very nice, is it? But instead, if you say, oh, yes, I hear you. You're having a really hard time. I'm sorry that you're having such a hard time. And I really wish that I could help you. But this is a situation where I can't actually do very much to help you. And you can tell them, I'm here for you. My ability to help is limited. But if you need someone to talk to, you can talk to me. If there is something I can do, then I will. But that ultimately, this is something which you're going to need to figure out on your own. So it's considering the manner in which you communicate to others. Not only the content, but also the manner. And the motivation. Why are you saying what you're saying? Because look more closely. You might think that you're dismissing the person because they need to figure it out on their own. But look more closely and you might find out that actually you just don't want to be bothered. Actually, you don't want to deal with the situation. Maybe you actually just don't like the person. Or maybe you don't like talking about certain topics. Or you don't like hearing about certain subjects. What's really going on? So look more deeply at your own mind as well, and make sure that you're seeing the situation clearly. And if you still come to the same conclusion that the person needs to figure it out on their own, then communicate that to them as gently as you can. But still, I would encourage you, be open to listening to them. Listen to them talk about their experience. Demonstrate your compassion by listening if there's no other way. Okay.
And Liz asks, what Pali word or phrase did you translate as goodness?
Let me check the Pali text. I have it here. Kusala. The Pali word is kusala, which is commonly translated as wholesome. And that's usually the word that I like to use for kusala. In this particular sutta, I chose goodness. I think because I decided that progress reliably and correctly in wholesomeness just sounded a little bit awkward and clumsy. So I went with goodness instead.
And then Liz also has a comment. I think when we're doing the best we can, caring for a sick person, we also have to let go of the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Recognize that ultimately some things are beyond your control. You can try really hard to help somebody get better, but there's some factors that you can't control, and they might not get better regardless of what you do. So we always start with that mind of equanimity. It's the same with teaching Dhamma. I teach Dhamma all the time, but I also know that many of the people who hear it will not understand. Or if they do understand, they will not practice accordingly. And you have to make peace with that, because that's just the way things are. If you make a problem out of it, well, then you're just making yourself miserable for no good reason. You're just making yourself miserable unnecessarily. So we teach with a mind of compassion. We help others with a mind of compassion, but we also help others with a mind of equanimity, because otherwise we get dragged down. It's what they call compassion fatigue. So this is not a Buddhist term. It's used in psychology. Compassion fatigue is somebody who's practicing compassion, but without equanimity to balance it. They're trying to help others, but they're getting so wrapped up in other people's problems that they take it on in their own mind. And it weighs them down from the inside, burns them out from the inside. So we always have to practice equanimity. Like, yes, I want you to get better, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you get better. And if you don't, that's okay too. Don't say that, by the way. Don't say that out loud. But that's the attitude in your mind. Okay.
And a couple of thank yous from Gita.
So I want to share a lovely story. I've shared this story many times, but it never gets old. So at one point, my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, he was very sick, and he had to go to the big hospital in Bangkok. This is when he was in Thailand. He had to go to the big hospital in Bangkok to get treatment. So he's lying in the hospital bed, very ill. And his teacher, Ajahn Chah, came to see him. And Ajahn Pasano got really excited. He was like, yes, my teacher's coming. So lovely. He's so wise and compassionate. I'm sure he'll be very supportive. So his teacher, Ajahn Chah, walked in the room, said, either you'll get better or you'll die. And he walked right back out of the room. So this is not the right bedside manner for most patients, just to be clear on this. But Ajahn Chah, so my teacher's teacher, he saw that Ajahn Pasano was ready for that kind of teaching. He saw that that was the right thing to say at that time, at that place, at that time. But for most people, in most times, that's not the right thing to say. Okay?
And Priyas, Ishan, and Jens also say thank you. Elaine has a question. Can you comment on the possible effects of karma on the three types of people who will not take proper care of themselves in spite of having knowledge and opportunity to do so?
I feel like that's two separate questions. Is that two separate questions?
It appeared as one sentence. If you want to,
So first off, when we talk about karma, it's very important to be clear that in Buddhism, we speak about karma, which is action, deliberate action, and vipaka, which is the result of that action. Is there clarification?
Yes. So it's on the third type of person who will not take proper care of themselves, even though they have the knowledge and opportunity to do so. So the person who hears the teachings and encounters the Tathagata.
So this is the case of somebody who has the knowledge of how to take care of themselves, but doesn't.
And that's just like the first person, the spoon in the soup.
Well, I would actually say that in that case, it might be the case of somebody who they're missing some piece of information or they're missing some motivation. So in that case, they might not have a complete picture of the Dhamma. They might have heard some teachings, but not enough or not the right ones. Because I think what she's saying is somebody who they have the Dhamma, but they're not applying it to their lives. They don't see why to apply it or how to apply it. Yeah, sometimes they just haven't heard the right teachings, or sometimes they're just really stubborn. Something interesting I find in the suttas is that in many, many places, the Buddha says that one of the biggest obstacles to our practice is stubborn adherence to opinions. The more tightly we cling to our opinions, the less likely we are to develop wisdom. One of the lovely reflections that we can do is just think, whatever your opinions are about something, and reflect. My opinions are probably wrong. Because let's be realistic, if you're not fully enlightened, then your opinions are probably wrong. There's not really any getting around this. At some point, we need to face the facts that much of what we think about the world is wrong, rather than understanding. So some people, they just cling so stubbornly to their own opinions that no amount of teachings will help them. So you see that actually with the anti-science people these days. No matter how much scientists talk about the discoveries they've made, some people will refuse to accept it. Such as climate catastrophe. 99% of scientists agree that the climate's getting worse. It's caused by humans. It's reversible. And yet, hundreds of millions of people refuse to accept that. Strange, isn't it? Or the pandemic. So expert epidemiologists, people whose life work is to understand how dangerous it is, how serious it is, and yet hundreds of millions of people reject that and value their own opinions more than the experts. It's really strange. And ultimately, it just comes from self-centeredness. My opinions are the most important. That's how we tend to think. My opinions are the most important things in the entire world. So if experts have different opinions than me, well, they must be wrong. Couldn't possibly be me that was wrong. That would just be crazy to think that I could possibly be wrong about something. Again, this is how most people think, and that's why one of the reasons why the world is in such a mess these days. So again, the Buddha placed tremendous importance on questioning our own opinions, questioning our own beliefs. Why do we think the way we think? Why do we believe what we believe? Is it actually based upon direct fact? Or is it just an opinion which might be wrong? An opinion which might be distorted or mistaken? We really need to investigate these things. Okay.
And Elaine also says that hearing the sutta put the teeth into something Ajahn Brahm has said, which is you can't always cure, but you can always care.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And Eleanor has a follow-up question saying the compassionate choice would the compassionate choice be choosing to help a younger person than an elderly one who will probably die sooner anyway?
I don't get involved in those kinds of decisions. Again, I'm not in the healthcare profession. So that's the kind of ethical choice which I'm happy I don't have to make, because that gets really uncomfortable. So again, in those situations, you have to weigh the pros and cons of both sides and try to pick what seems to be the most compassionate. So when it comes to weighing the relative ages of people, well, that gets really complicated. And I can't come down solidly on one side or the other. I don't feel like it's right for me to come down solidly on one side or the other. I can see really good arguments on both sides. So again, I would leave it up to your own conscience if you're in those situations. In the case of teaching Dhamma, in my own case, I'll teach anyone who comes, whether they're young or old. Although the Buddha did clearly say that it's easier to practice when you're young. It's harder to practice when you're old. It's easier to start Buddhist training when you're young. It's hard to start it when you're old. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, even when somebody is old, if they hear the Dhamma and it makes a mark in their mind, that carries over into future lives. So you're not wasting your time. Sharing the Dhamma with elderly people is not a waste of time. It only seems like a waste of time if you're still lost in the belief of YOLO. But if you understand the sequence, the endless, well, beginningless, hopefully not endless, the beginningless sequence of lives, then you recognize that it's never a waste of time, no matter how old somebody is. There's an interesting sutta where a group of elderly Brahmins who, in the sutta says they were 120 years old. So just about as old as a human can get. Humans very rarely live longer than 120. They rarely live even that long. So a group of Brahmins, 120 years old, came to see the Buddha and to ask him for some advice. And interestingly enough, the Buddha spoke only about morality. He spoke only about doing good deeds. And you read that and you're like, wait a minute, these guys are about to die. They don't have time to do good deeds. They might not live another year. You can only do so many good deeds in 1 year, especially when you're on your deathbed. Why is the Buddha talking about good deeds? Why isn't he talking about some like super deep wisdom teaching? Why is he talking about something so ordinary and mundane? And again, it's because he's not thinking about it in terms of YOLO. He's not thinking about it in terms of one life. He's seeing a broader picture of how what we plant in the mind in one life carries over to the next. So maybe he's like, so the Brahmins came and they're actually saying like, okay, we wasted this life. We're getting close to death and we clearly haven't used our lives well. We haven't built up our spiritual foundation. What can we do? So the Buddha is planting the seeds for them to build up a good foundation in their next life. So maybe in their next life, they'll start when they're young instead of waiting until they're on the border of death. Okay.
And then Eleanor said, so should we still help people out if they're mean to us? Like, is it okay to not like someone?
Of course you should help out people who are mean to you. Definitely. You should help out everyone who you meet one way or another. But you also do need to be realistic about your own safety. And if being around somebody is emotionally damaging to you, if they're constantly verbally and emotionally abusive, then sometimes you just have to say, this is not healthy for me. I can't stay in this situation. And you wish them well and you move on. You leave them behind. You let them live their own life separate from yours. And of course, if somebody is physically harmful, then you should not put yourself in harm's way. So we do need to be realistic. We need to make sure that we're not sacrificing ourselves to that degree. But at the same time, if you have the opportunity to help somebody, then just because they're mean doesn't mean you shouldn't help them. But it may modify the way that you help them. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that a person who is mean-spirited is making themselves miserable. Hating is not pleasant. Hostility is not pleasant. Cruelty is not pleasant. Somebody who lives with a habit of hostility and cruelty is really unhappy. They're miserable. So try to cultivate some compassion for them. It's like, oh, how sad that this person is so mean all the time. They're making themselves so unhappy. I hope that they learn how to be kind. That will be for their own benefit as well as for the benefit of others. And you might still want to keep a distance from them. Okay.
And then the final comment was from Geeta, who said she has a brother who's holding tightly to opinions. She wants to help, tried many times, but she's just very sad. He's a Buddhist with much doubt.
Well, I have one of those too, except for the Buddhist part. Otherwise, I've got one of those too. Yeah, at some point you just have to acknowledge that there's not really anything you can do. You try and you try and you try, and it fails and it fails and it fails. And at some point, you just have to say, I'm wasting my time. And that's sad. It's uncomfortable. But sometimes that's just the way it is. So you wish him well. You hope that he figures things out. And you recognize that currently you're not the one who's going to be helping him figure it out. Because you've tried and it didn't work. You tried and you tried and you tried and it didn't work. At some point, you just have to acknowledge this is not working. Sometimes you can point them to somebody else who can help them out. So in your case, your brother is Buddhist. That's great. Mine's not. So yours is Buddhist. That's great. So you can point him to Buddhist teachers who might be able to help him. But you also need to acknowledge that maybe he doesn't really want to be helped. Maybe he's actually not so interested. So that's another thing to figure out. Does he actually want to be helped? Does he want to improve? You can't force somebody. So this comes up in, for example, addiction therapy. Somebody who really does not want to give up their addiction will not. No matter how much you try to help them, they will not give it up. Only when somebody sincerely wants to give up their addiction can they be helped. So you might need to face the facts that maybe your brother doesn't want to be helped. So try to figure that out. Does he want help or not? Or maybe he does want help, just not from you. That's another possibility you need to consider, especially since you're a relative of his. Maybe he just doesn't want to hear it from his sister. Maybe he needs to hear it from somebody who's not related to him. It's always more complicated with family members. Sometimes it's a lot easier to get a non-relative to help out. So investigate a bit closer. See what's going on there and if there's another way to help him. Okay.
And lots of thank yous from Elaine, Gita, Pucharika, and Eleanor says, I wish you had live streams every day.
We tried that at the beginning of the pandemic, but it was running us into the ground. So out of compassion for ourselves, as well as all other beings, we chose to scale down a bit.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining in and always being so attentive and diligent. So you can come back again tonight at 7:30 to hear Dhamma talk from Bhante Suddhaso again. So it's Bhante Suddhaso Day. And you can join in and participate then for some meditation as well. And of course, you're free to join the rest of the week, tomorrow and Friday as well. And then as far as announcements, if anyone's interested, the monastery is planning a winter retreat next year, 2021, in January and February. So if you have experience staying at a monastery and would like to stay here for a month or two, send us an email and we can get you more information about that. So thanks everyone for joining in, and we'll see you soon. We can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
All right, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.